speaker, which Dr. Joe Michell. And Dr. Joe Michell is Associate Professor of Economics in the Bristol Business School at UWE Bristol. He's a macroeconomist reviewing patterns and cycles of national and international financial performance data. He also researches issues related to banking and to financial income distribution and the political geography of deprivation, with reference to Brexit and to job losses and financial effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. I don't have slides prepared, so I apologize. I'm just going to speak without slides. For the most part, I've got a couple of things I will share my screen for, which I will bring in later on, and I'll try and stick to my 10 minutes. Do interrupt me if I'm overrunning. I've got quite a lot, so I probably will need some nudging. Let's start with some framing. My feeling about discussions of debt, deficits and so on at the moment is that it has become very abstract. And if I can set up two very extreme sort of ends of the discussion, I think there's an Austerian end who are ideologically opposed to state involvement, state capacity in general, and use public debt as an instrument to try and reduce the state. And I think we saw that in the UK very clearly with the previous Conservative government, and I think it's very clear in other parts of the world too. My knowledge of the South African political context is very, very weak, so I'm not going to try and say anything about that. I hope you can help, you can tell me. I'd like to know more. So at one end, I think we've got the people who just always say the debt is too high, and they say that because they don't like the state. They want the state to be smaller. At the other end, we've got people who say that public debt is a meaningless number. You just don't even look at it because that's not something that we should care about. What we should care about are social objectives, etc. And I think that's equally wrong, actually. I think that the claim that you can just ignore the size of the public debt, the size of debt interest payments, which, as Michael correctly said, can be thought of as a rental stream. They have strong distributional implications. If you're paying 7, 8, 10% of GDP in interest payments to a particular group, then you are moving income around your economic system. I mean, unless you just somehow say that you're going to set all of those interest rates to zero, and therefore there is zero distributional effect. Other than possibly for the United States, and I think probably not even for the United States, that view that you can just ignore the public finances, I think is also incorrect, which means we have to put ourselves somewhere in between these two positions of it's not a problem, it's always a problem. And that, I think, then comes down to numbers. You've got to put numbers on it. How much is manageable? How much is a problem? So what are we scared of? What is it what are the dangers here? And it's often not spelled out. The Austerians in particular just say, oh, it's bad. Debt is bad, and it's almost like a moral argument. So what are we scared of? Exploding debt dynamics mean that debt service costs increase as a share of GDP, as a share of tax revenues, and that has distributional effects. It redistributes resources from the public sector to rentiers. It redistributes, in many cases, from poorer individuals to rentiers. That's one possibility. Now, some people will say, default is an option. We're scared of default and all of the financial instability that comes with default. In a case of somewhere like South Africa, which issues in Rand, default probably is a policy choice. I mean, we have seen sovereign defaults by sovereign currency issuers, but in general, that's because they deem that's the best way to get out of whatever situation they're in. So if we say, well, it's unlikely that South Africa can default technically because it's Rand issuing country, it's a monetary sovereign in the terminology, then your constraint is currency devaluation, exchange rate devaluation, or inflation. Price rises, currency devaluation, those things tend to go together. And those are serious outcomes that we should be scared of. I mean, a serious currency devaluation has profound welfare implications. It can compress consumption incomes substantially. It can raise the cost of imports. It can raise the cost of required inputs for capital investment and so on. Likewise, inflation beyond a certain level. I mean, I don't mean 5, 7, 10%. I mean, serious inflation is a major problem. So you're dealing with, I think, genuine and serious risks here of an exploding debt dynamics, serious currency devaluation, inflation, and you're trying to balance the risks of those bad outcomes and your judgment of the likelihood of those bad outcomes versus the things that you have to do to avoid them. So I think that everybody involved in this debate should be asked to put forward some sort of cost benefit analysis and put forward numbers onto it. From the Austerians, give us the cost benefit analysis. You think that, an extra 2% of GDP on investment spending for climate related mitigation or adaptation or whatever is worse than the cost on the financial side. Those arguments, I think, very quickly fall down once you ask people to put numbers on it. But I also think those at the other end should put some sort of numbers to these things. So let me say what kind of things, what are the relevant metrics? What are the numbers that we should use? I mean, I think people should be asked to make some kind of forecasts and they should then be marked to market. And we all get it wrong. I've started making forecasts and every year they're wrong, but you learn something from seeing what you got wrong. So the Austerians should be said, okay, you tell us what happens if you refollow your policy proposal, tell us what you think is going to happen, and then you'll see that they get it wrong. But I think also people on the left who are proposing different approaches should put numbers to what they're doing, and then they should be marked to market. We should look back in a few years' time and see, did we get it right? Incidentally, that IMF projection for the UK 2024 is going to be wrong. That debt to GDP number is going to be much higher, and I think interest costs are likely to be higher. That was on Michael's slide, but that's not relevant to this. What are the relevant metrics? Economists tend to like balance sheets. They tend to like taking expected future streams, discounting them with some interest rate, which tends to get pulled out of the air. And so you get down to one number. You get a balance sheet measure, debt to GDP, which you can argue about net, gross, what do you include as assets, what do you include as liabilities? I think it's wrong. I strongly disagree with this view because I think it's all about the flows. And I like to see explicitly what people think the flows are going to be. And let me be a bit more clear on that by sharing. Let me see if I can share with you my screen. Share screen. How do I do this? Share screen. Oh yes, screen 2. Share. Participants can now see my screen. Does that work?
It does.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay.
Right. Thank you.
You can boil down debt dynamics to a very simple set of numbers, and Michael said much the same thing in his presentation. So the first term here in the first equation, I'm sorry to do algebra so early in the morning, but this is very simple algebra. The first term is D with a dot above it. That is the rate of change of the debt stock. So is your debt stock increasing, decreasing, flatlining? And this depends on S, which is your primary surplus, the difference between taxation and spending, excluding interest payments. And it depends on the growth adjusted interest rate. That is the nominal interest rate minus the nominal growth rate. So if your nominal interest rate is 7% and your nominal growth rate is 5%, then your growth adjusted interest rate is 2% multiplied by the current debt stock. That is all you need to pin down the path of future debt to GDP and interest payments as a share of GDP, interest payments as a share of tax revenues. You need tax and government spending separated out. So those are the variables you've got to play with. If you believe, one, that a continuously exploding debt to GDP ratio is not sustainable, and I do believe that's the case, particularly in countries further down currency hierarchies such as South Africa, then these are the variables you have to play with. You can adjust the primary deficit or you can adjust the interest rate. Now, you can adjust the interest rate by adjusting the mix between bonds and monetized instruments, monetary issuance, assuming that you pay lower interest rates on monetary instruments. So the interest rate, I think, is to a degree a policy variable, and that is part of the mix. I'm going to stop sharing because I think I don't want to say anything more about this algebra right now. Hold on, not new share. How do I stop sharing? Stop share. There we go. Now I can come back to here. I'm using up my time quite rapidly. How long have I got, Chair?
Well, I've given everyone a little bit of leeway, but you are sort of at the end of the leeway.
Right. Goodness me. Can I have 2 minutes to to wrap up? And then maybe
Yes, we have 2 minutes.
Okay, let me come back to screen sharing. What I have here, hopefully you can see it, is something I set up for the UK. So you can ignore the time series up to 2020. What it lets us do is plug in these variables and see what happens. So if we put in an interest rate of a nominal interest rate of say 9%, which I think is approximately where South Africa is, and a nominal growth rate of, I'm not sure where your nominal growth rate is, say 5%, then we can adjust government spending and taxation. And I think you've probably got a primary deficit of about 2%. So let's set this to a primary deficit of about 2%. If we stay at those levels, you get this outcome on the right-hand side, the pink graph. You get an exploding debt to GDP ratio. This is over 50 years. Now, the starting point is about 100 because it's the UK. It's about 80 for South Africa. But you can see the starting point is irrelevant. What matters are those variables I showed you. So one way or another, we need either to reduce the primary surplus, and you need to reduce it substantially. You can see reduce the primary deficit substantially to bring that debt stock down to a declining or stable trend, and or we need to raise growth or reduce the rate of interest. And you do need substantial shifts from the position you're currently in based on the material that Michael showed us to get down to a stabilization path. What are the elements? 1 minute. And I think Michael, I agree with Michael really in terms of the menu he laid out. They're not pleasant set of choices. Raise taxes, and I think that has to be the biggest part. And again, I would want to see numbers put to this. What is the balance between raising taxes, debt management in the terms of shifting from short to longer term? And I see your yield curve is rising, meaning longer term debt is becoming more expensive. You have a lot of outstanding index-linked gilts. And so debt management is not immediately easy. You have yield curve control, monetization, whatever you want to call it. You have inflation, which will bring down, will raise nominal GDP if you raise inflation. And for some of these, the financial repression, although I don't like the term, you do have to think about the international context. Do you need capital controls of some kind in order to bring those in? So I conclude by saying that I think what the left needs is a credible projection with numbers of the balance between the various tools. Because I think we all agree on the tools. Some are just saying that we use monetization much more extensively and allow ourselves to run a much larger deficit. And probably a useful way to move forward would be to put benchmark numbers on these different options and see some projections. Okay, I'm well past my grace period, so I stop there.
Thank you so much, and thank you for restraining yourself. We'll certainly have more time to discuss as a group later, and I'm hoping some of those points will come through there.